Oh, it's so good to see you. For everybody that's just joining, this is Cheryl. She is the powerhouse of a female leader. We were connected several years ago when you were just getting started, and I'm really excited to share with our audience how much you've grown, what you're doing for the maternal health and infant health space. And I'm just going to tee you up to talk a little bit about your background. You are an industrial engineer from Cornell. You have led global innovation and creativity to really like put Malaysia and Southeast Asia on the roadmap for femtech. And because of that, I believe you were nominated top 10 women in digital from L'Oreal. So we are just so excited to have a sliver of your time and hear how you were inspired to build Tiny Health. So with that, I'll let you tell a little bit about your background.
Thank you. And then right back at you, Lauren. I mean, from one female founder to another powerhouse female founder, from our personal experiences is what birthed this idea of a company, right? So for me, my personal story to why I started Tiny Health, which is basically the first ever at-home testing platform that's focused on moms during pregnancy. Well, we have preconception and postpartum as well, but also the first ever baby stool test for gut health. And the reason why I started this goes back about 6 years ago when I gave birth to my daughter through C-section. She was breached. Both my kids were actually breached. And I knew that the C-section was likely. And I started researching what, C-section babies health, are their health different than vaginally born babies? And I uncovered all this literature around how there is a distinct pattern between C-section babies and vaginally born babies. In fact, babies born who've been exposed to antibiotics also have a different gut. Yeah. So I was really curious and just wanted to dive into the research and then learn that I learned a few things. One being that the baby has no microbiome in the womb. They're pretty sterile in the womb. There used to be a debate about this, but it's now pretty proven in science. So the baby actually gets the first flush of microbes or colonization of microbes through the vaginal canal. So the vaginal microbiome of the mom is actually really important. It sees the baby's gut first, and then some fecal fluid during labor. So labor is also pretty important and essential for this whole process. That's how the mom's gut microbes get seated in the baby's gut. And then through breastfeeding, again, magical, the mom continues to transfer her gut microbes through the breast milk, which is fascinating. So I learned that. I'm like, okay, that's why C-section babies have a different gut, because they're not passing the vaginal canal and they're being exposed to antibiotics from the operation and things like that. And it's linked to higher babies who are born by C-section or have been exposed to antibiotics during labor are at higher risk for this allergic condition or progression of allergic diseases, starting with eczema, and then food allergies, asthma by age 6, and then hay fever as an adult. So these allergic diseases are immune-mediated diseases. Yeah. So then I learned that it's linked to the immune system. So when we're born, we don't have an immune system, and it's being trained and informed by these bugs that colonize the infant gut at birth. Yeah. I know this is a lot to digest. We can dive into all this later, but I just learned so much. I'm like, oh my gosh, every paper I read, I was like, struck by how is my pediatrician or my OBGYN not telling me all this education, right? Yeah. And then I was like, okay, if it's so linked to the immune system in early life, then it has to be in the right balance. So we can dive into more. But what then I learned was that, I was reading all these papers, groundbreaking research out of academia from Johns Hopkins and UCSD and all that. And it takes an average of 10 to 15 years for this academic research to be put into medical practice. So I'm like, okay, can my child wait until until my doctors recommend it? And then I learned that the answer is no, because there's a critical time period in early life when the baby's gut is so malleable. And then after 3 or maybe 5 years old, so 3 to 5 is where it's transitioning into a more mature adult-like state. It's harder to change it. You can still change older kid or an adult gut. I changed mine, but it's just harder. Like it takes more discipline and work, right? So
Yeah.
really the true critical phase is in that first 1000 days. And so I'm like, okay, can I intervene myself? Are there interventions I can do? Because I don't want my daughter to get, you know, asthma. Because at 6 months, she actually got eczema,
Yeah.
uh, pretty bad form of eczema, food sensitivities to, she was kind of allergic to um, tahini, like sesame and all that. And then she was also not a good sleeper. She was never able to nap more than 45 minutes, like always crying, not quite colicky, but like almost there, you know? And so when I had my son, 2 years later, I got pregnant with my son and he was breached again. So I was like, oh no, what if I have another C-section? This time I want to prevent it. You know, I don't want my son to get all these things. So I started researching more into like, is there a stool test for babies? You know, um, and I wanted to check in if I've course corrected my daughter's gut, and I couldn't find a stool test for babies. They were all using reference ranges, and you cannot use an adult reference range for a baby because they're completely wrong. And I
Totally.
was also looking for a technology that can see the strain, the bacterial strain in my baby's gut, and there was no company who did that. So then I had a magical birth with my son. I had a VBAC. I had a vaginal birth after a C-section at home. This was April 2020, in the middle of the start of the pandemic. Actually, everything was shut down. My husband couldn't go with me to the hospital if I had a hospital birth. So I was really thankful, grateful for the home birth. Um, but I had a vaginal birth. And so I started Tiny Health a week after he was born. Because I was so inspired by his birth, and then thankfully he didn't have eczema or sensitivity, and he slept hours. He could sleep like 2 3 hours, so really different from my daughter. So that's kind of my origin story for why Tiny Health exists, because I needed this test for my own kids, to take control of my own family's health, and I wanted to make this accessible to all the families in the world.
Well, Cheryl, I'm so thankful that you did this, and I'm so grateful that you're on sharing your story because for those that are just joining, I just want to give a little context. This is Cheryl. She's the founder of Townie House. She's an amazing mom, female founder, and investor. And I'm so happy this exists because for those that are joining that are maybe from your audience, my background, I'm a primary care nurse practitioner. My name's Loren. I'm founder of The Natural Nipple, but we have such a similar passion. And when I was beginning my research, I was working with Dr. Maureen Grower, and at the time she had the only longitudinal data set that I could find. So what that means is like she looked at babies from preterm birth to 4 years of age to really try to understand exactly what you exemplified, which is this first 1,000 days. Like we have a very unique opportunity to like as you said, you can change your microbes as you become an adult and hopefully change some of those autoimmune or inflammatory conditions that you may be suffering with. But as you're training the immune system, this first 1,000 days is so pivotal. And so really what I began to focus on was in these preemies that were being born that had imbalances of gut bacteria, we created the medical construct for what dysbiosis is because nobody really knew how to measure it.
Mhm.
And it's really important to be able to measure it because we were finding these babies were getting sepsis, suffering fatalities, necrotizing enterocolitis. And so my very first research question, this was back in 2017 of that data, was okay, what can we control in this clinical setting? And, you know, with your second son, you had the opportunity to have a vaginal birth, and I'm so happy for you. And you know, as we're transitioning like into a very volume depleted healthcare system, we're finding that more and more women are kind of getting rushed into C-sections. And so you were skipping out on those really important microbes that come from the vaginal canal. And so for everyone that's joining, Cheryl and I are really passionate about at the start of life, how do you truly optimize a human being's longevity from day one? And biohack this baby's immune system really so they can function at their best. They don't deserve to have eczema and colic and dermatitis and diabetes. So what can we do proactively if the data is really slow getting translated into industry? And so you really did something incredible because I'll fast forward. What I found clinicians can control in this setting is like, even if you had perinatal antibiotics that wiped out your good bacteria, if you had a C-section, if, you know, the baby was in the NICU getting colonized with some antibiotic resistant microbes that are cause a lot of inflammation, we can still give the baby breast milk for longer. And this is ultimately the most protective thing that can be done. And but you wouldn't know if some of the conditions that your child is suffering with were caused from an imbalance of bacteria unless you could measure it.
Yeah.
And those babies were fortunate, right? Because they're in the clinical setting. We had access to an Illuma metagenomic sequencer. And then when I came out of this research, I was so determined to create a solution that makes breastfeeding easier. I was like, what is happening at bedside in the NICU that's causing it to be challenging for moms to continue producing milk or get a latch? And
Mm-hmm.
sure enough, 92% of parents were really struggling with bottle to breast transitions. The milk just flows so different or unnaturally fast for that preemie, which actually we have data that was just published in a top tier medical journal, Advances of Neonatal Care, demonstrating that. And I'm like, how do we make this safer for the baby? Colonize the gut with the correct microbes to really give them the best fighting
Mm-hmm.
chance. And kind of the missing piece for us was translating this to the consumer, which is okay, well, and now what? What can you do about it? And it was really frustrating, like the last 6 years while we were building the product to really make it flow like breast and be matched to mom's shape, because I was seeing so many of my patients suffer with exactly what your babies suffered with. And there was no test I could refer them to on the market. Like, to do these scientific studies, you really need like a minimum of 1,000 samples of stool, and you've bridged that gap. And so I'm just so happy to hear this, because I remember one of my patients, she had like spent at least $10,000 like going to baby chiropractors, baby acupuncture, like what is wrong with my baby's digestion and why can't they sleep? And we finally got to the root of the dysbiosis and were able to shift it. But I didn't have a tool to continue doing that for so many patients at scale. So um, I would really like to delve in a little more, less on the science of microbiome and how it informs the lifelong immune function, and more the immediate impacts on mom and baby. And you have a personal story. So can you talk a little bit about some of the positive outcomes that you've seen by early correction of
Yes, of
microbes?
course. And just to note, because you're talking about your research in preterm NICU babies. So when we first establish our proprietary test for infants and babies, we had to start somewhere, right? So we started with about 3,000 term babies, I would have to say, from all over the world. So it's pretty representative. And then, term babies grow and their guts mature differently from preterm babies. Now we have over 25,000 families. So our data set is so expansive and growing so quickly, like more than 25% month over month of mom and infants in the world. Um, and we just partner with Astride Medical to process the NICU, the preterm data set. So we, hopefully soon we'll have some indication of how the preterm gut is changing, or how does it map to a term baby. So you're kind of going back to your question, yeah, the impact, we see like dramatic impact, especially in the first year. Some babies, so it's kind of coming back to the birth mode. The birth mode, vaginal or C-section or assisted or not assisted, is the number one factor influencing the baby's gut at birth. The second most important gut modulating factor is breastfeeding,
Yeah.
as you mentioned earlier. So when we look at the data from research, a C-section baby's gut can be healed. And this is the paper I read from Dr. Noel Mueller, who was at Johns Hopkins at the time. He wrote this review paper called Moms Matter, because he was trying to basically say that, even, if you have a C-section signature,
Yes.
breastfeeding is actually more impactful to course correct than anything else, because the mom is continuing to transfer those beneficial microbes.
Yeah.
The secondary thing that I learned from that, though, is then mom has to have the right microbes too. So if mom's gut was deficient of those microbes, which I found out I was, so the kind of funny story to this is with the vaginal birth and the breastfeeding with my second son, I thought, oh, he should be fine, right? But no, when I tested my gut was completely deficient of bifidobacteria, the most essential bacteria, and I wanted to know if I had infantis. I did not have B. infantis, the
Almost
strain that is
in
very.
the 60s,
I'm sorry.
by that critical microbe was nearly wiped out in the 60s because of the rise of formula marketing, by the way. So it's not a surprise that you didn't have it.
Yeah, so there is another paper that shows that 9 in 10 babies do not have B. infantis. Um, and, we think it's because of modern lifestyle, more antibiotic use, even our food, even if we're not taking antibiotics directly, it could come through pesticides and, toxins in our environment and things like that. And antibacterial soap from, people being afraid of germs in the COVID era, so many reasons. But I learned I was formula fed, and I had antibiotic exposure in early life. I had a poor, terrible diet in my 20s in college and all that. And
Yeah.
in my first job, I was really, and alcohol also kills a lot of the good bifidobacteria. And bifidobacteria is very sensitive. This is one of the bacteria that should be 50 to 90% of an infant's gut in the first year. This is what protects the baby's immune system, trains their immune system. And if the baby is deficient of that, then their immune system isn't trained correctly. So it's really essential. So I actually needed to support my gut. I needed to course correct my gut. So I wish I knew this preconception, actually. So I had maybe 6 to 9 months to train my own gut, to course correct my own gut and pass the right bacteria onto my son. But in the event of my son's vaginal birth, so I had to supplement. I knew that I was supplementing myself with B. infantis, and I was supplementing him for B. infantis. So in only 3 weeks, just 3 weeks of B. infantis, his gut, and I stopped supplementing with probiotics, because you don't want to over supplement. There
Yes.
is a danger in over supplementation as well, which is why you test, not guess. Don't guess. Get the data yourself, because then that B. infantis strain, now that we can see strains in our test results, persisted and bloomed to 90% of my son's gut in 1 year, but when he was 1 year old, because I breastfed him for 2.5 years. And so
Yes.
there's this ingredient in breast milk called HMOs. Basically, it stands for human milk oligosaccharide. It makes up a third of breast milk, and this is the food to the probiotics. It's the food to the beneficial bacteria. So without this prebiotic, this HMO, the probiotic may not stick around, because it's like, if you imagine your gut, your child's gut being a theater, 10 seats in a theater, you want it to be filled by 9 out of 10, like these, I have these, these are bifidobacteria. This is what should be, 9 of them out of 10 should be bifidobacteria, these really beneficial bacteria. And maybe 1 in 10 should be these, guess what this is? You know what this is. E.
Proteome.
coli. Yeah, exactly, E. coli, because they look like threatening. So these bugs in the right combination and balance train the baby's immune system, right? So in some babies that we see now being born by C-section or exposed to antibiotics, it's 9 out of 10 these unfriendly bacteria, and maybe 0, no protective or friendly bacteria. So what happens then is that it's too inflammatory, and the baby may not be sick or may not be exhibiting symptoms, but oftentimes they do. They're colicky, gassy, they have bloating, they can't sleep very well, they may have eczema, or maybe not yet, but it's kind of like, the probability or the risk of it is pretty high. And so for my son, if I didn't have it in my gut, then I'm not passing on these bifs to my son, right? So he needed some support, some direct support. So I supplemented him 3 weeks, and it literally pushed out all the unfriendly bacteria.
Yeah.
And you don't want too much. So the danger of over supplementing is that you have 10 of these filling up all 10 seats. Then you have no immune training from unfriendly bacteria. Your immune system needs to be exposed to some unfriendly,
Yeah.
but not 90%, and most maybe 5%. So that's kind of why the right, and I know I'm getting scientific here, but it's important for us to understand why, you don't
Yes.
just take a probiotic, or you don't just kind of, you need to know like
And
the dose, how long, when do you need to
exactly.
stop. Mm-hmm.
And specific to you, which is why I love the ability to do repeat testing. So like you can actually see, um, and going back to something that you were saying, so these bifidobacteria, I was shocked when I was learning about, basically, it's not uncommon that you were lacking that as a mom, because we, in the last, 50 years, have really begun to have a shift towards more cesarean deliveries. We can talk about why in a different episode, but also marketing plays a huge role. Like, it was correlated directly with the rise of formula marketing in moms. It's amazing to be able to be a working professional and feed your baby the way you want. But we really almost, because this wasn't in existing formulas, almost wiped out this incredibly important microbe. And if you think about microbes, sometimes you think of them as unfriendly. Like, I love the little E. coli visual because
Yeah.
um, exactly like you said, if you have them out of balance, they can really dictate the way you eat, think, and function. But a little bit of the good stuff, it's really, the breast milk is your first life vaccine in food, and it's free. And bifido bifidobacillus is really important because microbes help us like digest food. They help us synthesize vitamins, important B vitamins that you actually need very early on to make blood cells. And so imagine if you didn't have that. Imagine if you didn't have this critical little friendly microbe that we've been evolved to coexist with. We live with our microbes. We are 90% microbial DNA and 10% human. And I just want to echo on one thing that you mentioned is, and why supporting breastfeeding for as long as possible is so important to us as a company. Supporting women, empowering them. If you have to go back to work and give a bottle, you're not going to have this latching time and frustration that you get. 83% reduction compared to other bottles. So you can really keep getting a healthy latch without the baby streaming and continue this process of lactogenesis. Your body gets that signal from the baby's saliva in terms of what antibodies to create.
Mm-hmm.
And you also create oxytocin. So you can continue like getting the milk filling up and replenishing. Um, what's really
Yeah.
interesting from the HMO, and then I want you to pepper in, um, is the ability to correct. We're doing a little bit of education, but that's why I love so much what you're focusing on in the first 1,000 days, because you can't always control that most important variable for passing on good bacteria, which is the vaginal birth. Come back in, make breastfeeding as easy as possible, make understanding the ratio of the type of microbes you're living with accessible to every consumer, and give them then the tools, to create the HMOs through. So this is the human milk oligosaccharide that is a prebiotic fiber that feeds all of these really healthy bacteria, and it's passed through breast milk. And it actually, in babies that have sepsis and neck, what we see is their gut lining, the junctions in the epithelium, so the lining is open, and it's letting stool and toxins pass directly into the blood. The HMO literally goes and it helps bind and repair the gut epithelium. And so that's why it's so important for you to know what's in your gut and what's on your skin,
Yeah.
because our bodies can heal themselves. It's not all doom and gloom. It's more like, here's why it's important to know these things, and then we have tools to support you.
It's pretty incredible. And in fact, we see, so like if someone was vaginally, a baby was vaginally born and formula fed only without breast milk, there is no food, the prebiotic for the probiotics. So even if mom had passed on the bifs,
Yeah.
these bifs, the baby's gut, they kind of plunge. We see them high at birth, and then they kind of go down with weaning of breast milk. So, you know, obviously some moms can't breastfeed and have to formula feed, and, you know, there are reasons for that. But from a scientific perspective, we do see, you know, baby's guts, like, you know, changing with formula feeding. Like this goes down, and then imagine in that theater, as I mentioned, 10 seats in a baby's gut. If these go out, then E. coli, salmonella, streptococcus, staphylococcus, these unfriendly bacteria that are all in our environment, right? It's just there. It's not supposed to really inhabit a gut. So you do need, you know, you have to make sure your baby has enough of these protective bacteria, and bifidobacteria has many strains. That's why we do strain tracking in our app, because you could have, there are bifidobacteria dentium, B dentium from oral canal that inhabits baby's gut. And that's actually not adept to digest HMOs in breast milk. They are actually not great. So what strains, what bifido strains inhabit baby's gut in early life also matters. There's 4 specific ones. B. infantis, I mentioned, B. breve, B. bifidum, and B. longum is really adept at digesting the HMOs in breast milk. And it should be, you know, like 80–90% of an infant's gut in the first year. So we see, you know, like you ask about impact, right? And kind of, so we have stories just like yesterday, I think someone posted on our IG story, like a customer, not a paid influencer at all, but she said her baby was colicky, like literally had colic. And after 2 months of implementing our advice, basically a supplement, the baby needed a B. infantis supplement, and continued breastfeeding. The baby's symptom went away within a couple of weeks. So, you know, and it's a different baby. It's a happy baby. The baby was able to sleep and all that. We hear hundreds and maybe thousands of these stories. Another one who even have an older child, a 2.5-year-old child with pretty bad eczema symptoms. And at the point, a 2.5-year-old, I think was still getting some breast milk, but eating solid foods, right? 90% solids and 10% breastfeeding. And we were able to recommend dietary recommendations to improve short chain fatty acids. So in the first year, acetate, a form of short chain fatty acids called acetate, is really important for baby's gut lining. It really protects the baby's gut lining. And as the baby grows and eats more solids, you want to see butyrate function going up, and acetate sort of like, you know, being a secondary short chain fatty acid. So what, I know this is all pretty technical, but all these functions that are like fiber fermentation that the bacteria aids is so essential for gut lining, gut health, you know, basically to protect against what, you know, is a popular term called leaky gut, like as you mentioned, when the tight junctions are weak, and then the unfriendly pathogenic bacteria like E. coli are passing through into the bloodstream and causing issues and inflammation. So that's kind of what you don't want. So in early life, you really want to set and train the immune system correctly, because otherwise, you know, eczema is basically, you know, allergens kind of irritating the skin. There's a skin gut axis connection here, right? And then food allergies is like dietary allergens, and then asthma, respiratory allergens. So these are all basically a sign of, the reason why these are all called immune mediated diseases is because your body's immune system is haphazardly responding to these environmental dietary allergens. They shouldn't happen, but it's a sign that your baby's immune system wasn't set up correctly in the first 1,000 days. Yes. So now we have the technology to look into your baby's gut. Why wouldn't you want to know, right? Like, you know, and then be able to address it to really prevent and avert chronic conditions.
I would love to just touch on that point because, you know, it's possible that like you become alerted to like, okay, what's going on because of immediate symptoms in the baby, like where fussiness, inability to sleep, lots of gas, maybe abnormal amounts of vomiting. I mean, we even have a term for babies like, oh, it's just a colicky baby, like as if it's a personality type. And it's really because they don't have a way to communicate with us yet. Being able to pay attention to, is something going on? But even if they're not exhibiting any type of symptoms, why it is important, because you got on the solid foods topic, to understand if you have these critical bacteria in place is because over time, so our study actually looked at babies to 4 years, like the same ones that we sampled in the neonatal unit, to 4 years of age. So we were actually able to make relationships to different species level profiles of the real estate. I love the analogy of seats in a theater because I always was calling it, I'm like, imagine you have a piece of land and it's you put in the real estate of all this commercial development. It's really hard to change that moving
Yeah.
forward. You know, it's really hard to change the avenues and the lanes, like once they're already laid. So let's get it right in the first 1,000 days. And you also have an opportunity when you're giving solid foods, as you're saying, to understand which ones are actually best based on your unique child's microbial profile.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I mention this is you might not have any super alarming symptoms for the baby, but we were hunters and gatherers that were very nomadic and we were eating with the seasons. And that's how we cultivated this really interesting, shifting relationship with the microbes that we live with.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't really have access to those type of diets anymore. So getting these type of insights from Tiny Health is really important in the long term. What we were seeing was actually, a more diverse microbial profile, and we don't have to delve into different names, and you have a really robust data set too, is really correlated with actually less not only autoimmune, but neurodivergent and mental health issues. There's less anxiety and depression later in life. And when you
Metabolic,
really begin, yeah,
like
and
diabetes.
metabolic issues as well. And
Mhm.
when you really begin to go down the tunnel, like you did, of like understanding how to correct this, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Like how the reason I love the microbiome is because it's something we control. There is so there for so long was a nature versus nurture. Is it genetic? Like what can I change about the DNA that I'm given?
Well, you
Is
can't
mental
change
health
your DNA, but you can change your microbiome, right?
exactly. And your microbiome helps turn on and off switches on your DNA,
Yeah.
right? So if you have overall less information, the data is already showing it. You're less likely to have struggles with neurodevelopmental delays as well, autism, ADHD, mental health struggles, and schizophrenia. Some data is even coming out and supporting. So I just wanted to throw that in there in terms of like really like the long-term effects. And this is why the World Health Organization has so supported women to getting to just 6 months of providing breast milk, right? It's because of all these essential things really that inform the
So
microbiome.
here,
And that can prevent 300 billion in preventable medical costs every year.
100% help like so many chronic conditions, not just childhood chronic conditions, but adult chronic conditions like autoimmune conditions are linked back to early life. So going back to diversity, right? So the fascinating thing is the first 6 months, the gut diversity of the baby should be very low because the baby's only job in the first 6 months is to digest breast milk, technically, right? We do see, or milk. If we do see an impact of formula, we do see higher diversity and a little bit more maturation with formula feeding. But any amount, the more breast milk you have, even if you're combo feeding, and some people do have to, or you get donor milk if you really can't breastfeed and you're formula feeding, the breast milk suppresses that maturation in the first 6 months, which is kind of what we want, right? In the first 6 months for immune training. And then when the baby starts solids, so I mentioned the 10 seats in the theater, or that land with maybe 10 homes, right? The baby's gut doesn't stay like with that 10 seat capacity, it expands. So we now, you and I have a theater that can seat about 500 seats. So the baby's gut actually is that's the reason why the first 1,000 days is crucial. Because not only is it developing, meaning it's growing, so that it's like 10 seats and then 20 seats. So actually when it starts solids, bam, you get like maybe 100, maybe not 100, let me think. You can maybe find 50 microbes. So 10 at birth and then 50 when you start solids. By 1 year old, probably around 100 seats. So as the baby seat expands, you want to fill it with, again, the right combination of microbes, right? Diversity and all that. But the breast milk, the HMOs and the BIVs from breast milk, if mom had BIVs, would be ensuring that the right balance is there, right? So that's kind
Yeah.
of why breastfeeding in a way for as long as someone can, like minimum 6 months, because that seat is, the theater is only 10 seats, very essential. But for as long as you can, and the reason why it's so impactful is because if there were major imbalances later, because you could have everything perfect in the first 6 months in a year, and then what happens? Baby gets to daycare, gets sick, get ear infection, and
Totally.
then they need antibiotics. And then bam, I mentioned earlier, bifidobacteria is very sensitive to antibiotics and all these interventions. And sometimes and it's completely depleted, it's really hard to get them to recolonize, But because the breast milk has HMOs, remember the food to these probiotics. If your child uh, needed antibiotics and then you take a tiny health test and you see those bifs coming down, there is a way to replenish it through, again, breast milk. Is so save some of this pump breast milk if you can, for as long as you can. They do have the HMOs in it, or there are now supplements with HMO supplements in them. And then you pair that with probiotics with the right BIF strains, you can help them recolonize. So that's kind of why, breastfeeding for as long as you it's really like there to modify the microbiome to get it back into balance.
And you mentioned something so important. I'm really happy that you touched on it, because the World Health Organization says minimum 6 months, because like you're talking about the critical time frame. We
Actually,
just want to,
they say 2 years now. WHO recommends 2 years.
yeah, that's the recommendation, is 2 years, and that's minimum is 6 months.
Yes,
But
minimum.
for 2 years, the reason like this window is so important is because you're born, as we mentioned before, with a native like immune system, right? Like imagine you just have an iPhone and there's no iOS.
There's no
And
immune system here.
exactly. And so you're developing these first 2 years your T cells. And you actually are heavily reliant on the way nature designed us is the mom is probably going to be in the same environment as the baby. And she's facing, and she has a mature immune system that's facing the kind of microbes that this baby or viruses will need to fight. And so the reason like that skin to skin contact, and like our goal is really how do we make that easier and seamless. Like if you have to be away from your baby, you can still come back to breast when you desire, because it's such a sensitive and specific process of crosstalk. So um, like if they were exposed in daycare, like you were mentioning, to a virus and had to take antibiotics, your body is already making actually the appropriate antibodies,
Mhm.
because the baby's saliva crosses through the milk duct and is actually telling the mom's body the antibodies to create. So I say this because it's marvelous. Like we are so intricately designed to be able to face the world. We're actually such fragile, you know, species, but if we can support each other in these processes rather than stigmatize, okay, I understand in modern society, like we have no maternity leave in the US actually unless you work as a federal employee. So like this isn't protected like by
Mhm.
the law. We're seeing that diminishing. And of course, 92% of parents are struggling with continuing breastfeeding. And so
Mhm.
it's a matter of how do we join forces, Tiny Health, the Natural Nipple, to create tools that actually drive impact so we can continue, evolving and functioning at our absolute best and optimizing. It is longevity day one. It's optimizing your epigenetics. It's creating the right tools to make it easy.
Mhm.
And I'm so happy that you created this. Really, it was a pain point for me in my practice.
Yeah. Yes. And we're really, what we're doing is empowering parents, right? Moms and dads too, families to take charge, take control, be educated, and have the tools. You're building a tool, I'm building a tool that makes it easier for parents to be able to give their babies the best start in life. And that's really what it is. I mean, before I had Tiny Health, and I didn't know about the whole nipple confusion thing, and my daughter had a little bit more of that confusion as well. Like I felt a little bit hopeless. I felt like no one understood my journey. Nobody understood, I like to be told, oh, your baby's colic's just going to pass, or to be told like, here's more steroids for eczema.
Yeah.
And yeah, the fussy baby who can't sleep. No, I mean, in a way, something in me told me there must be more to this,
Yeah.
right? There must be a root cause, can't be all personality. And I found answers, in a way we're giving answers to parents that seek it now that their providers can't currently provide because our doctors didn't go to school learning about gut microbiome health, right? A lot of doctors
And
aren't
a
trained in
relative
this.
a relatively new field too. So I'm excited that you're bringing up this topic because our study with University of Southern California, Virginia Hills, bless you, Cheryl. um,
Excuse me.
and sorry if I interrupted you. There's just a little bit of a lag. Were you finished with your sentence?
Yeah, yeah, I am.
Um, it was interesting, right? Because sometimes you live inside of your world of like what you've been focusing on and what is really like you're passionate about and what's interesting for you. And a big learning clinically for me now after coming out of the other side of this research with the National Science Foundation, and we were getting actually the same grants that back NASA to build this product to really biomimic and flow like breastfeeding as closely as possible to make this journey easier for parents is now going, and into the hospital we were actually able to demonstrate the importance of making the flow more like breast, and they shifted from a leading formula and bottle nipple company to our product. And now it's really clinical education because there's so much that has been missed once doctors and nurses have graduated and the field has really been updated. Like, that's why I love the work that you're continuously doing with Tiny Health and gathering more data. And we are doing a prospective study now. So with the next 285 babies being born out of USC, not only are they getting the natural nipple, but the nurses are getting the education of tools that they can give to these patients as they're being discharged. And so I think there's really interesting, like we do continuing education now in the hospital setting as we're opening up a phase 2 multi-site, and it's so needed. Like what we're finding is OBGYNs and pediatricians that are honestly, and I have felt this way in primary care until you came along, frustrated because it's like we know that this is important, but we don't have a tool or a service to offer, and you just want the best possible thing for your patient's health. And I'm really excited that this exists now. In respect of your time, I want to ask, can you name the top 3 common questions that you get, and the answers, like valuable insights and practical information?
Let's see, from parents or from practitioners?
It could actually, if you're getting the same questions from parents and practitioners, that's valuable, and then one from each.
Well, sometimes, actually, recently we've been getting a lot of like, oh, how does Tiny Health compare to GI map or GI effects? If you've heard of those stool tests, those are what we call more traditional or conventional stool tests that has been around for a long time, and they're using PCR technology to sequence the gut. We use shotgun sequencing, which is now the gold standard in microbiome research. So all microbiome research papers now, if you look, they use a shotgun because it can sequence the entire gut. So the trade-off with the conventional PCR stool test is very limited. It only gives you a subset of microbes to detect. So you may be sequencing only 5% of your gut, maybe 1% of your gut. You really don't know, and you're not seeing the full picture. So we think for clinical utility, how can you make, I don't know, clinical advice based off of something, a sliver of your gut and not the full gut, right? So that's one thing we always say. And then the second thing is people are using these PCR tests for babies and kids, and they're using the wrong reference ranges. So like, for example, this is really important. You cannot use an adult stool test for an infant or a baby or even a 2-year-old kid. One really stark example, using a PCR test and adult reference range, if you see 5% E. coli type bacteria. So if you and I have 5% E. coli, we are pretty sick. We probably have IBD or IBS or some sort of like gut, like digestive issue. But a baby can tolerate a lot of E. coli, like say a 2-month-old baby, 5% is perfect. Because remember I said there has to be the right balance. You want like 90% BIF and maybe 5%, 10% E. coli, right? So the adult reference range would tell you that this is 5% E. coli is bad, use an antimicrobial on your baby. Like, no, this is actually good. So that's why it's very dangerous to use an adult test for a baby. You can't do that. So that's one common question we get like all the time. And this is what I really want to understand. And then this another common question is like, oh, our test does take a couple weeks to get back to you, like 2 to 3 weeks. And it's already pretty quick in industry using shotgun sequencing. Normally it takes 4 to 6 weeks. We've optimized that to 2 to 3 weeks. So pretty fast. They're like, oh, my infant's gut is changing so rapidly. Is it still relevant when we get our results back? And the answer is yes. Even though it is malleable, it's very malleable in the first 1,000 days and it's changing quickly. You have these baseline microbes, right? So I remember I said the 10 seeds and those seeds are expanding. Unless you are making really huge dietary or, like probiotic, or you're weaning from formula, or even if you're starting solids, they shouldn't be changed. They're just expanding. When you're starting solids, you're expanding. So you're still going to get those baseline bugs there, and the foundation. And it's actually good to get a baseline test and then retest, right? You want to see, actually, that's why 2 samples minimum is really important, because you want to see the trend. Is my baby's gut trending according to the right developmental milestones in the gut, or is it trending the other way around? So 1 data point may be helpful, but 2 data points is even better. So as far as kind of like, oh, I changed, my baby is now was 2 months old, now 4 months old. That baby's the same, unless you do something super drastic, like give your baby a new probiotic and whatnot. But even then, you want to see, okay, before probiotic, what was it? Post probiotic, did you give the right strains? Is it actually working? So it's always beneficial to get at least two samples.
That's really, really helpful. And again, it's kind of like your baby wearable. Like it doesn't matter too much if you measure your sleep one night and you did one thing different, right? You're living a life, and it's really important, I think, to have these milestones and a baseline test, and then, try something, because sometimes you don't know if this is still a growing field. So, like, the other players in the gut might be interacting with metabolism in a very unique and different way than it did for another baby that worked really well with this probiotic formulation. So that's why repeat testing is super useful. It's like, measure what matters for you. Measure what matters and see what solid foods you've introduced, or what probiotic you've tried, or even if you're exclusively breastfeeding, what you were eliminating from your own diet that is working and is not working for your baby. And it's really simple, because if you have a repeat test at a certain time stamp, like, every 3 months, you can actually measure what matters. And yeah, I'm just really excited for our prospective study that's coming up, and being able to potentially offer the opt-in option for moms that are being born out there at University of Southern California, Verdugo Hills. Is there anything else that you want to pepper in or announce?
Yes, I just remember, we just launched this feature too. We might not even have announced it yet, but it's live. If you do have a tiny health test and results, we just launched strain tracking. So some fascinating data. Sometimes moms don't want to give their infants probiotics directly. So if they're breastfeeding, they'll take some themselves. Strain enables you to see if the probiotic managed to colonize the infant's gut. So we're now able to see, like, for example, I was taking this probiotic called Seed, seed.com, and because they're pretty clinically backed, and I see specific strains passing through my son's gut. So really cool to see that passing through the breast milk, because if you're breastfeeding, then you may be passing on these microbes to your infant, right? Of course, if you feed your infant the specific probiotic directly, then you can see the strain names popping up, the brand names popping up, but I think that's such a cool feature because no other test in the market that I know of enables you to see a supplement working in action like that. There's so many supplements out in the market. Like sometimes it's like, do they actually work? Which ones are snake oil? Which ones are like credible? You really don't know, which is kind of why I'm so proud to launch this feature, a strain tracking feature that you can actually see products in the gut, like you see things working or not.
Oh my gosh, that is such valuable insights, Cheryl, and thank you for sharing that because so the first study that I did, I mentioned, was on like factors you can control and like to correct the dysbiosis in the preterm infant setting. But then later I went on to write my dissertation more focused on mom. And the reason I mention this is like there's so much that
Oh,
you're thrown
I think you're breaking
at. And,
it.
oh, can you hear me? Oh, wait a second until it loads. Um,
Okay, I think you're
I'm
back.
oh good.
Okay.
I'm really happy that you mentioned mom because as you're having a baby, I think you're bombarded with information about what to do best for your infant, and obviously that's already what you want to do. Like you're you're doing your best.
Yeah.
And a lot of the focus is away from how we care for the mom's health and support them through that journey. So I just wanted to pepper in for your audience that so my research went from like that first study to my dissertation that was written was actually looking at maternal health and inflammatory factors and how those inflammatory states in the mom, so even environmental, like were they single, were they really low socioeconomic status, were they exposed to a lot of smoke? How did that impact the inflammatory cytokines that were being produced in the breast milk? And the reason I say this is I see with your new strain feature so much opportunity to support women from a biological standpoint who, like if your body is under constant duress, and honestly, there's not a lot you can do about your environmental situation instantly. It's a way to support you. Like your microbes are a little army for you if you make them work,
Yeah,
train
for
them
sure.
properly.
Well, we didn't even get into this, but there's so many factors around the pregnancy microbiome and the gut and the vaginal microbiome that plays a role in reducing pregnancy complications like gestational diabetes or GBS, preterm labor. And not only is it important for you to check in as early as possible in pregnancy if you're passing on the right microbes to your baby, it's also important for mom's health. So there's the term called primordial effect, right? Primordial for the mom and baby, so it's not just the baby, which is kind of why we sometimes we see families testing their infant's gut. The next step really is not just to retest the infant's gut, but test the mom's gut too,
Yes.
because especially if you're continuing to breastfeed, there is a strong connection. So you want to also improve your gut health along the way, and then long term, the baby's going to eat the same diet, nutrition. They're going to be in the same environment you are as a parent. You want to make sure that your whole family is working towards good gut health too, not just the infant, right?
Yeah.
So definitely, the mom matters. Like Noel Mueller's paper, Google that is really important.
Oh my gosh. Well, this is just, we could talk for hours and hours and hours. I am so excited. So, for everyone that joined late, don't worry. What we're going to do is post process this episode. We're going to post it as a podcast and then on YouTube and also write it up as a blog. So, any questions that you had in the chat, we'll make sure to address and answer. So, we send that out in our newsletter. If you go to thenaturalnipple.com and subscribe, in about 2 weeks, you're going to get sent all of this juicy information that Cheryl shared. And I'm just so thankful that this exists. Where can we find you?
You can find us at tinyhealth.com. And if you write in and email us at hello@tinyhealth.com, I pretty much read all the headlines and I have access to it. So, and also very responsive on IG. So at tiny.health, follow us for more educational info like this.
Amazing.